Okay class, in this video I'm going to set up the failover cluster members. Last video I set up the iSCSI server. I also created a disk and shared it on the network, and I allowed FOC1 and FOC2 to attach that disk. So I need my DC up and running, so I started that, iSCSI, FOC1 and FOC2. So I'm going to connect to FOC1 first. I'm signed in as a domain admin, and I'm joined to the domain. I have my IP already set. So I'm going to go to Manage, Add Roles and, Manage, Add Roles and Features. I'm going to go all the way down to Features, and I'm going to install Failover Clustering and add the tools to manage it. Restart if needed. Again, make sure you're signed in as a domain admin, not the local admin. Now I'm going to do the same thing to FOC2. Go all the way down to Features. Install Failover Clustering. Restart if needed. Now I'm going to go back to FOC1 and wait till it to finish. The last cluster we set up was network load balancing. And that cluster, all the servers ran that service. And they could each answer requests. In failover clustering, only one server is going to answer the request. If that service goes down, it will automatically start up on the second server. So this is going to improve high reliability, meaning it's going to be harder for the service to go down because you have multiple servers hosting that one service, but only one at a time. With the failover clustering, they all hosted that service at the same time. So it's a different type of clustering. If a service goes down on one machine, it'll jump over to the other machine and continue to run. So it's a different type of clustering. It's a failover clustering, meaning if it fails, it's going to jump over. Or the NLB, network load balancing, they all were running the service, and the NLB process would direct the request to the server that had the lowest amount of usage. So it's a little bit different than what we've done in NLB. I'm going to pause the video while it's installing. Okay, it's down on FOC1. I'm going to check FOC2. It's almost done. So while that's finishing up, I'm going to go back to FOC1. I'm going to go to Tools, Failover Cluster Manager. I'll go back to FOC1 to see how it's doing. Okay, it's done installing. So it's installed on both FOC1 and FOC2. I'm going to do everything from FOC1 to set up the cluster. So before you can set up your cluster, you have to verify that both machines can handle a cluster. So I'm going to validate configuration. I've never done a cluster on ACE-IT before, so I'm hoping it'll work. Click Next. I'm going to enter my first server name, foc1.contoso.com, add. Then I'm going to add foc2.contoso.com. Then click add. So I'm going to test both FOC1 and FOC2 to see if they can host a cluster. Make sure the hardware and software is sufficient enough to host the cluster. I'll click next. I'm going to run all the tests. Confirmation. I'm going to pause the video because this will take a while. We're only worried about errors, not warnings. Okay, it passed all the tests. I have some warnings, but no big deal. So I'm going to check this box, and it'll automatically launch the Create Cluster Wizard. By doing it this way, it saves me the trouble of having to re-enter the cluster members. So I'm going to click Finish, and now it's going to launch the wizard. Click Next, and you can see that it's already my cluster. It didn't even ask me for my cluster members. So I'm going to call this cluster. And every time I create a new service or the cluster itself, it's going to create a virtual machine in Active Directory for that new service or the cluster itself. I'm going to assign the IP address of 10.0.0.100 to my cluster, that virtual computer. It's not a virtual machine, it's just a computer account in an Active Directory. I'll show it to you once it's done. Click Next. It's going to make sure that IP isn't being used. The cluster is going to be called cluster, has two nodes, FOC2 and FOC1. I'm going to unselect this. I can see that the witness disk is here. It's attached to this machine. It could be attached to FOC2, it doesn't really matter. But if I left this checked, it would automatically add that, and then I would be missing out in a lab. I want to show you how to manually add the storage to the cluster. This will work fine, but if I show you this, you won't know how to add storage manually. So I'm going to do it manually. Again, this takes a long time, so I'm going to pause the video. Okay, my cluster is done, so I'm going to click Finish. I'm going to go over to my DC to show you the account. I'm going to go to Tools, Active Directory Users, and Computers. I'm going to expand Contoso, go to Computers. Now you can see I have a computer account for my failover cluster. That's not one physical machine, that's my, I don't want to say virtual machine, but just a computer account for that cluster. So I'm going to go back to FOC1. So here's my cluster. If I go to networks, I can see I have one cluster network. It's used for both the cluster and the clients. If I go to nodes, I can see I have two members. Both are up. And I want to show you this. The cluster will see, will take a vote to see if it's up. If it has a majority vote, the cluster will identify itself as being up and running. If it doesn't have a majority vote, at that point it shuts itself down. So right now, with only two cluster members, there's no way I can get a majority of vote. There's no way to break, I need a quorum. I need an odd number to be able to do a vote. So what I'm going to do is use a disk called a witness disk to be a voting member of the cluster. So basically, if a member is up and it grabs their witness disk, it can vote actually twice. So I'll actually have 3 votes. So I'm going to add that witness disk to my cluster. It's already attached to FOC1 or FOC2. Now I'm going to go to disk and add a disk. And it can see that disk is 1 gig. When I created that disk, when I formatted it, I gave it a label of witness. I can't see that witness, the label itself. So what I'm going with is the size. You might have 4 or 5 disks on this machine, but try to match the size. Click OK. So if you highlight the disk, you'll see the label down here. So now I have it as being part of my cluster. And it's available to use. So I'm going to highlight my cluster, then right click it. Now this would, if I had left that checkbox checked when I configured my cluster, it would have automatically did this for me. But I'm going to manually do it. So I'm going to go to More Task, Configure Cluster Quorum Settings. Click Next. I'm going to select the quorum witness. Basically, that disk is going to be a voting member of the cluster, so we have an odd number of cluster members, and at that point, if we get at least 2 of them up, one of the cluster members and the witness disk, then at that point our cluster will identify itself as being up. Click Next, and I'm going to configure a disk witness as opposed to a network file share witness, or if I had a cloud witness. This is what we have available, so that's what we're going to use. If you have multiple free disks and you don't know which disk is which, if you expand this, you can look at the size. So I want to choose the 1 gigabit disk. Next. And finish. So if I go to storage, then disk, I can see that that disk is not available anymore. It's now assigned as a voting member. There's nothing I need to do to this disk. I'm not going to put anything on this disk. If I go to this PC, I won't be able to see the disk as something I can save to. If I go to disk management, it's still there, but it's being reserved. Don't try to force it online or anything like this. Right now, it's being used by the cluster. I created the disk on the iSCSI server, shared it on the network, configured the iSCSI initiators on both these machines, so either one can grab this disk and mount it. When it does, it's going to place to be part of the cluster and to be used as a voting member in the cluster quorum. Okay, next thing we're going to do is we're going to create some more disk and add some services that we're going to host in our cluster. So that's it for this video. Thank you.